Hey, I'm Slam. I play Hammer and Prot Monk. My friend Arugula made a monk guide a few days ago, so this is my response and addition to that. I'd like to thank Luke for proofreading my map movement section, and Purif for reminding me of a stance variant I initially forgot to list. If you want to skip to any section or just see what I'm going to talk about, check the segments in the YouTube play bar. Monk is the most interesting profession to me with perhaps the highest macro and micro level skill caps. It also benefits so much from different levels of awareness that playing a perfect Monk match seems almost unattainable. Monk is also the most open to interpretation, with wild variations in bar, equipment, and playstyle from player to player. If you ask 20 random arenas monks for their bar, you'll get 20 different answers. Starting with your setup, I have mine on screen now as an example. It's true that many people play at a high level with default keybinds, moving with their keyboard and clicking to target and use their last 3 skills. It's certainly not necessary to optimize this, but doing so is an objective improvement. I think the most valuable feature of my keybind setup is how easy the cancel key is to use. On screen now is the equipment you'll use for any kind of heal monk: infuse, flag, and RA. The major healing rune is only for spotless mind and soul bars to bump it up to 15 seconds so that you can cast it on wand instead of staff for the double half recharge. The restoration rune benefits you in GVG due to how much map movement matters and how often it'll be disrupted by enemy dervishes and archer NPCs. It also offers some defensive benefit against rangers, necros, and Lysidurvs. If you value this in RA against dervishes and pet rangers, it's a fine choice as well, but I don't find the need to kite much with dual stance and Vig Spirit. The recovery rune can be considered for GVG during May and November when Days Rangers become popular. It's mostly for RA where you'll occasionally see Days Paragons. If you take Purge Conditions or Contemplation of Purity, then you don't need it. I don't value the deep wound reduction very highly, but it's there as well. Even if you're playing an RA bar with no prots, the prot staff is fine. You can consider a high energy enchant spear instead, but you should keep the staff since it's needed for GVG anyway. Lastly, if you're not comfortable shield swapping, then Blunt or Lightning are the best to use as a default shield. Prot shares a lot of the same equipment, so I'll only cover the differences. I think that the Divine Favor rune is entirely optional, and you can run 3 health runes with 12 tactics, but no one really does that. Regarding the weapons, the half-high and high sets typically occupy 1 weapon slot and is switched from the inventory as needed. Doing this gives you room for an optional preference set. Mine's a 25 energy enchant set, but other monks run ones such as 30 energy or a spear focus for extra half recharge on Aegis and AOS. If you don't want any of these, you can run the half and dual high sets in their own slots for easy swapping. I've had deaths happen because I wasn't able to click my double high set on in time, so it's not entirely useless. Ideally, you want these 2 sets as well. They're from PvE, but you can trade the first one to a PvP character. The Suicide set is most commonly used when you've lost a fight and are falling back, but the enemy team blocks you in and wants to kill you right after the res timer. This one matters a lot more than the next one. The hammer is mostly for fun, but does have theoretical use to help push a lord kill through before the enemy team base reses, or to farm lord damage. These are bar variants for the 7 monk. I'm not going to mention the June flux bars for any position since they're obvious to make. You should try to use the infuse skill as little as possible, but you'd suffer from not having this against potential hard spike builds. You'll also find a use for it in standard matchups, to save collapses or deal with unaegist double mesmer spikes. Shield Guardian is very strong against apply rangers with a solo mesmer, but isn't advisable outside of that. Purge Signet is very valuable during May when enemy mesmers will often cover empathy with Mind Rack on your fronts and look for easy power leaks on the incoming cures. It's also a fine general option which gives you insurance against gimmick builds while not being bad in standard matchups. I don't recommend the Warrior secondary option for general use, since Dark Escape is both strong against mesmer damage and useful for pushing to save a collapse. Going Tactics also makes you lower your Divine Favor, which is obviously counterintuitive on a healing burst bar. November is the Wild West of monk bars, and no one dies anyway except for the NPCs. Keep in mind that you can still take tactics points for a shield requirement, but just can't bring any skills from it. Contrary to its name, you don't typically touch the flag at all in this position, it's just a relic from prehistoric times. Since the number 8 monk has the most map movement of any backline, dash is a staple here. If you don't expect to need that, you can consider Dark Escape or a Warrior secondary. Notice that you lower your healing by 1 to hit 11 prot, that's only for Spirit Bond bars. You can play with 14 heal and Word of Healing and lower the Divine Favor if you want. Snare on 8 is something you should talk to your team about, but is a game changer when you're running a build that would fall apart by splitting its damage characters. Prot Spirit is recommended for the boss Flux, which also means you don't need 11 prot. There's not much to say about prot bar variants. Dropping RC during May isn't required, but the additional energy helps a lot to spam Spirit Bond against the ridiculous amount of damage that goes out. The big bar up top is my go-to. I think it's the best one overall and would recommend it to monk players of any skill level. Shout out to Luke for showing it to me. I've included some other monk bars I like below, which I copied in order from left to right from Carla, Pekka, and Ollie. Here's how to build your own bar. I've listed every relevant skill that I can think of for general healing. You should virtually never stray away from the formula here. Some elite, even in May Flux, Patient Spirit, a Hex remove, a Condition remove, and some defensive skill. Patient Spirit is the most overpowered healing skill in the game and will never leave your bar. As for variants, I think Healer's Boon has its place in RA when you're playing against a Mesmer that gives you too much trouble in a normal bar. It's a sort of band-aid, where you're almost guaranteed a certain amount of time against many teams, but are heavily disadvantaged in the late game. It's an energy-heavy bar with low self-healing and is countered by being camped with heavy enchant removal, or getting blasted by an Ellie. Contemplation of Purity isn't as useful as it used to be, since Shaman Days have largely fallen out of meta. I think Spotless Mind is a bit overrated as it takes 10 seconds to remove a covered hex, as well as demanding additional energy to cover it. This one's experimental and no one plays it, but I think Reverse Hex is extremely underrated for RA. The most typical scenario is that a high priority hex will come in, followed by the caster targeting you to interrupt cure or immediately casting a cover. If you have perfect awareness and are unpressured and aren't facing dual interrupt, then the counterplay is to start casting cure right as they start casting the important hex. This generally works, but is unreliable for about 100 reasons. You can be on aftercast, knockdown, under heavy pressure, have a 1 second lapse of awareness, get interrupted by a second player, get messed up by your own fast cast, or have the caster get a fast cast. Additionally, both Empathy and Faint-Heartedness have a lower recharge than Cure. You could fake Cure against a Mesmer who's watching you, but this already requires 10 or more energy and isn't reliable. You could also Spotless Mind, but again, you're spending at least 10 total energy by covering it, as well as letting the hex sit for 5 or more seconds. For these reasons, I think Reverse Hex is the best choice when entering against Empathy and Faint-Heartedness. It's obviously weaker against most other hexes, such as Lightning Surge, where it would then likely be more energy efficient to heal it than remove it. Vigorous Spirit is most notable for easily dealing with apply poison pressure. Dropping this means you'll either hope your team interrupts poison, or you let them sit lower health and hope to get every word of healing through. Guardian has nice potential, but I find it generally unreliable. Taking it often means you're dropping Vig Spirit or a second stance, both of which have a higher impact on your matchups. Running a bar reliant on Guardian means you'll be abused by every team with a Curse Necro, Ranger, PI Wastrel Mesmer, or even a mildly coordinated frontline Mesmer combo. I think it makes for a fun bar, but is ultimately not something that can withstand serious punishment in the current 4v4 meta. I think Shielding Hands is overrated on heal bars and has similar energy efficiency to Patient Spirit in most cases. Protector's defense is valuable for its immunity from stance removal, which is meta on GVG Balthazar Dervs, and for being able to prevent damage on a teammate without an enchant. Dualiac Signet seems underrated for dual stance bars. It's useful in almost every match. Return has theoretically gotten stronger due to the absence of Shame, but I don't see any monks run it outside of AB. Whichever playstyle you settle on as a heal monk, it's important to remember that your main goals are to keep your team alive and defensive. Moving health bars up is effectively useless unless it prevents a death. If you only panic heal and never devote attention or energy to cleaning your damage, then you're just delaying a wipe. While healing is obviously always situational, here's a fairly reliable list of what you should aim to do, in order from most to least important. Your top priority is removing Deep Wound from pressured targets. This is always true in RA, but your prot has first priority on this in GVG. It's your prot's job to communicate when you need to take over until they can RC again. Here's an example of this not happening. My Mesmer is still in trouble after my word of healing, and with half a second left until his death, I choose to patient instead of draw since they don't have a Mesmer to shatter it. This was obviously a mistake. To no one's surprise, the next most important thing is using your biggest heal, usually the elite, on targets in danger of dying. Now, if you're not doing either of those, your next job is removing high priority hexes. These are usually Etherlord, Migraine, and Faint-Heartedness, but also Lightning Surge when you're under pressure. Since you usually have a single hex remove with a long cast time, this is higher priority than removing conditions. This is also more important to do than general healing since these hexes put your team extremely far behind. Next is removing Blind, Weakness, and Cripple. This is worth prioritizing anytime your team isn't immediately about to die. Then you want to remove medium priority hexes, such as Empathy and Insidious Spirit. While detrimental, they don't stop your team from functioning. Okay, so now your team isn't being threatened by death, conditions, or hexes. Depending on your bar, you now want to be keeping Guardian up and Signet of Rejuve on recharge. The more you spam Signet, the more effective it is, and every second you spend with it available is devaluing the skill slot. At this point, you've covered all the major bases. You're now spamming Patient Spirit and Vigorous Spirit if you have high energy, or just AFKing to recover. If you expect to be interrupted on your elite heal when the target gets low, then you're spamming Patient Spirit a lot. The obvious trap with the spell is not to use it on someone with 60 or less health while Shatter is available. You're better off going for even an unlikely elite cast in that situation. And finally, if you have nothing else to do and have high energy, you can clean low priority hexes and conditions when not expecting to need your remove soon. These include Mind Rack, Life Siphon, Poison, and Cracked Armor. Don't underestimate Cracked Armor, it's roughly a 40% damage increase for everybody except the Mesmer. I have less to say about protting because it has less rules and more variance in successful playstyles. The invariable part is preventing and removing deep wounds. Midline damage will usually follow fronts in standard builds, so they're the ones to keep your eye on. If you weren't able to prevent the deep wound and don't have or want to use Aegis on a knockdown, you can pre-remove it to reduce your chances of being interrupted. To time this, know that warriors will virtually always use Crushing Blow as the next attack after a knockdown. Be aware that RC is often the top priority for enemy interrupts, especially by rangers. Fronts will count down to their deep wound, then at least one interrupt character will immediately target you in anticipation of it. If it gets disabled or you no longer have the energy to do it, then tell your infuse to draw. They should always be keeping the deep wound off of you as well. Shielding Hands is probably your weakest prot, but is best used on dervish targets. You can also use it as a cover enchant for your more important prots. If the damage was originally 50 or higher but reduced below that by Shielding Hands, then Spirit Bond will still trigger. If you're playing against hard spike comps, try to identify either the one who initiates spikes, or the bar with the slowest skills to follow it with. Sometimes you don't have this option and just have to imagine who their highest priority target is based on death penalty or positioning. This is an overview of what to do in a teamfight with multiple monks. This is simple in theory, but will inevitably get messy during the match. Here's what your team should look like in a perfect world. The first thing to notice is that all three monks are as far away from each other as possible. Your fuse is as far forward as they need to be to reach your front line, and will be the one to push for splitters or flag pushers being collapsed. In other words, they go forward. Your flagger is the farthest player back, ready to help your flag runner or run to defend base, so your 8 goes backwards. Your prot should be somewhere in between. They follow the 8 back to base for large splits, but will typically stay with the main team. The arrows represent guardian targets. While you don't have to follow this example, your monks should agree on assignments for guardian targets to make sure that they're happening and to prevent overlap. One last tip about stand fighting is to tell your other monks when you see important interrupts like P-Leak and Complicate. GVG is made interesting by the fact that monks are worth more than 1 damage but less than 2. You can abuse this ratio with map movement. Understanding where you're supposed to be is the most valuable knowledge you can have as a monk in GVG. First, I'll summarize the general rules from the last section. 7 goes forward, 8 goes back, and 6 follows third damage. The first thing you should do in the match is identify how many damage you're at stand, and if possible, which role isn't present. Will be the blue team in all of these examples. We'll begin with the most common scenario. 7 players are at the flag stand with 1 damage absent. It's most logical to assume they're double running and no monk movement is needed. While they can technically solo split like this, it would be an extremely niche case where they willingly give up flag advantage just to be spotted and defended by your backup runner. Next up, 6 at stand, 2 damage missing. This is typically a double run with a solo split, or a rare case of 2 damage split. Either way, seeing 6 players means you send at least 1 defender back. As triple front, you prefer to have the Lissa or Mesmer Assassin defend 1 damage, but your 8 has to defend instead if your damage can't stop them from killing NPCs. 2 damage to your base means you send 1 monk and 1 damage back. Note that the split doesn't necessarily have to target your back door, instead it can be a play for your front footman on certain maps. Rarely you'll see 4 at stand. They're sending 3 damage with a monk to your base, so you defend this with 2 monks and 2 damage, typically a frontline and disruption character. After the match has started, you might see a situation where your damage is in danger behind the other team. This can be a splitter being snared and collapsed, or damage turning on a flag pusher. In this case, it's your 7's job to run forward and save them. Your prot will likely have to push up slightly to save the 7 after, depending on how many damage are around. Avoid the mistake of too many monks running forward, as there's still a stand fight going on and you may leave your other damage with no one to help them. Finally, a note about 28. In an even matchup where both teams have a full pit, you're forced to send 2 monks on offense, even though this leaves a single monk back against their 3 damage in your base. The reasoning for this is that 1 monk can't hold against a pit plus their 2 damage defense, and you won't be able to score any lord damage. If there's not a full pit, then you should follow the common rule and have 2 monks defending their 3 damage. Your 8 is better suited to be the solo monk on whichever side they need to go to. These are a few input tricks that'll help you on monk. The first trick is avoiding animation lock by timing your weapon swaps correctly. If you queue up a weapon swap during your aftercast delay, your character will freeze up and not accept any inputs for a short period. Training yourself to wait the 3/4 second aftercast before putting your shield back on will prevent it from happening. Next is cancel swapping. Attacking creates a sort of pseudo aftercast which will freeze your character if you try to weapon swap, but moving or using your cancel key will cut it off and let you swap. Keeping track of enemy skill use is a vital part of monking. Watching animations on the field can give you all the information you need, but often there's too much clutter or not enough distinctions between certain cast animations. This is where these targeting tricks are useful. Obviously you can click on a target, but maybe you aren't very fast with your mouse or are using it to move all the time. Here are other easy ways to keep track of a specific enemy. First is the tab trick. Your enemy tab order is saved if you target a friendly tab unit. You tab through targets until you find the one you want, then you can freely target allies or clear your target and then shift-tab to target the enemy again. Next is pinging. Make sure your team knows you're not pinging for them and that you do this between spikes. Ping the player you want to keep track of, and you'll be able to click your ping for the next 30 seconds to target them. Saving the simplest for last, you can stand next to who you want to keep track of and use target nearest. Obviously this is only an option in situations where your positioning doesn't matter. To end my guide, here are a few maybe not obvious tips for avoiding interrupts. A safe but unreliable way to guarantee your cast is to wait for the enemy mesmer to cast something, then cast while he's on aftercast delay. Additionally, being max range lets you run out for casts. Finally, you need to be aware of obvious times you would cast and have the discipline to hold the cast while the prediction erupts might come in. These times include standing up from a knockdown, chaining casts while under pressure, running into the range of someone, and the expiration of effects like Shame and Power Block.